with that being said, welcome to today's session, Azure DevOps Duet, dataMinds edition, which is a tale about how a development team and an operations team have to bond together and start using Azure DevOps for SQL deployments.
So for the next 90 minutes or so, we'll be talking about Azure DevOps, which allows you to do the full application management lifecycle, from creating a work item all the way to its release. And we'll be discussing both the cloud and on-premise versions of Azure DevOps, as well as its features, including source control, the boards, pipelines, artifacts, and test plans. Even though this is an Azure DevOps session, we will also show you GitHub Actions. And at the end of this session, you will have a basic understanding of the main features of Azure DevOps and how it can be used with SQL Server.
So in this session, one of us is from the SQL development team and the other from the SQL operations team. Our manager has decided that both teams will merge together into one DevOps team, so that we're all one big happy family.
In reality, though, this should be a real gradual process. However, since this is only a 90-minute session, we've taken it upon ourselves to speed up this process. In addition, our manager has decided that the development team lead will be the Scrum Master and the operations team lead will be the product owner.
Now, for those of you who don't know, a product owner is responsible for translating business needs into workable backlog items for Scrum sprints, which means they must speak to stakeholders at various levels within the business. In addition, they are ultimately responsible for prioritizing those items, even though they may get input about the priorities from various stakeholders.
And the Scrum Master's role is to empower the team to do those backlog items by encouraging how they work and removing any impediments that may appear.
Sander, before we go any further, let's introduce ourselves.
Yes. So I'm Sander. I'm a SQL Server DBA living in the Netherlands. I work for Waypoint Analytical, which is a company what does large-scale water, soil, and plant sampling, which is really interesting to do. I'm a Cloud and Data Center MVP, and I'm a major contributor to the DBA Tools project. You can follow me on Twitter. I have a blog, and if you have any questions after this session, feel free to send me an email. All the demo scripts you'll see today will also be available on my GitHub page. Just go to my GitHub, go to the presentations repository, find this session, and you will have all the demos there. You can use them, change them, reteach them, whatever you want to do with them. And now Kevin is going to do his bio, which is slightly more complicated than mine.
Well, thanks for that, Sander. On that note, my name is Kevin Chant. I'm a senior database architect living in the Netherlands. However, as some of you might be able to tell from the accent, I'm actually originally from the southwest of the UK. However, I live in the Netherlands due to the fact my wife is Dutch. So basically, I'm an Englishman in the Netherlands working for a French-based company because he met a woman in Australia. Now, whenever I say this out loud, I realise why Sander thinks this is complicated. So I have 24 years experience working in IT, and over that time I've worked in various sectors, including the banking, oil and health insurance industries. I've worked with all versions of SQL Server in one form or another, and I have various certifications, including both the old and the new Stad MCSC, and more recently, I became a Microsoft Certified DevOps Engineer Expert, which is fairly relevant for today's session. And also, as you can see there in my bio, I've also recently become a Microsoft Certified Trainer and a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. Now, I'm also on social media as well. I'm on Twitter. My LinkedIn has got a user-friendly URL of Kevin-Chant. I have my own blog, and my email address is available upon request. Anyway, Sander, the first thing to discuss is whether to use Azure DevOps Cloud Services or Azure DevOps Server. For those of you who don't know, Azure DevOps Server is the new name for TFS, which is the application you tend to install on premises to do your application lifecycle management. However, now it's been modified and rebranded to look and feel just like the Azure DevOps Cloud services that are available. Personally, I like to use Azure DevOps Server so that we can handle its security better on premises. Plus, it means we get to keep the backend SQL Server databases on premises for us to be able to do reports on that we just can't do with Azure DevOps Cloud services. However, the downside to doing that is that we'd have to build one or more servers with Azure DevOps Server installed for business continuity reasons. Plus, we may have to wait a while for new features to be made available because of the cloud-first strategy. Also, Sander, another thing which would be a bit tedious is that we'd have to maintain and patch all those servers.
But if you use the Azure DevOps services in the cloud instead, you wouldn't have to patch and maintain anything, as all of it is maintained by Microsoft for you. Plus, it's easier to install extensions from the marketplace.
That's true, and we can still secure it in Azure. Besides, whichever we use, we must consider security and compliance anyway, because we deal with financial data. Luckily, Azure DevOps is well structured and easy to manage.
So the main point we want you to take away from this is that if you install Azure DevOps Server, you would have to patch and maintain everything yourself, whereas with the cloud-based service, everything is done behind the scenes for you.
So, on that note, let's have a look at the hierarchy within Azure DevOps. So, as you can see here, Azure DevOps has its own hierarchy. At the top, you have your little icon, which represents your Azure DevOps account, where you have access to one or more organizations that you can see on the left-hand side here. Now, these organizations can be a company you work for, or if you work for a large enterprise, it might be just a division within them. Or, as you can see here in this example, it can be an organization you set up yourself for test purposes. Now, if you have the right permissions, you can change some organization settings. For example, you can change the name of your organization. However, bear in mind, if you do that, you'll change all of the URL references that you've got. You can view other things like the projects you have, usage within Azure DevOps, extensions. You can set permissions on the organization level here as well. Something we'll cover later on is that you can change processes that your projects use. So bear that in mind when we talk about Azure Boards, because it's very important. A significant change that was made to the repository settings a while back. As some of you are probably aware, there's a little bit of controversy surrounding the origins of the master naming convention within Git. With this in mind, Azure DevOps now gives you the ability to give another name for your default branches within Git. And in fact, it's not just Azure DevOps who have done this. You can do this also in GitHub. In fact, GitHub now main is a de facto standard name. And if you install Git for Windows now, you'll also be presented with an option to change the default name of your main branch. And there's various pipeline settings you can change as well. And you can see how much storage you're using for all of the artifacts within your organization. Now, if we go back to your main organization screen, you can see here that you've got one or more projects that are available. If I click on this one, which happens to be called dataMinds, you can see all the features that Sander was talking about in the introduction on the left-hand side here. And again, if you have the right permissions, you can change some settings at the project level as well. For example, again, you can change the name of the project, or you can give it a nice logo, like we've decided to do for this evening's session. Now, each project contains one or more teams. And from here, you can actually manage your team. So if I click on this particular team, for example, you can see I can now remove members here. Now, we can set permissions for those teams here as well as logical groups and some built-in groups within Azure DevOps. So for example, if I click the dataMinds team again, you can see I can fine-tune some permissions here at the project level. Now there's some other interesting settings here as well. For example, if you click on service hooks, and now I click on create subscription, you'll see I can set up service hooks that connect up to quite a few third-party services, including popular ones like Jenkins and Microsoft Teams. Now you can manage the board settings for your project here, either at the global level for the whole project, or you can set up configuration for your individual teams. And you can change the separate teams just by clicking at the top here. You can also manage GitHub connections. Again, there's some various pipeline settings you can set at the project level. If you click on repositories, you can view all the repositories you have. And again, if you don't have the permissions to change the default name of your branch at the organization level, you can do it at the project level instead. And then you can see the storage just at the artifacts level and some interesting settings for test plans.
Now you're talking. Remember, there are other things we can configure as well if we dive even deeper into these settings. And the main point we want you to take away from this is how Azure DevOps is structured with all its features. So anyway, now we've done the main admin stuff. Let's cover version control options with Azure Repos in Azure DevOps.
You mean like source safe?
Well, maybe something a little bit more modern. I actually worked with this product, which was horrible. But Azure Repos supports multiple version control systems, including Git and DFVC.
Well, that'd only be for your development work though, right? Because it sounds like version control would be complicated for the ops folks to learn.
Actually, I think you'll see when an ops team starts to use source control for its daily work, it will start to perform better. At my company, we've started putting all our scripts and all our documentation in source control, and that can be used throughout the IT department.
Well, I'm always game for performing better, Sander. Tell me more.
Well, like I said, Azure DevOps supports multiple version control systems. Because we want to use a distributed version control system, Git will be the best choice for us.
Okay, so what about branching strategies? Because I hear they're pretty important.
Yes, they are. And well, there are various ones we can use, like Git flow and the GitHub flow.
Well, what's the main difference between those two? Because they sound pretty similar to me.
They are pretty similar. The major difference between the two is that with the Git flow, you don't directly merge into the main branch unless it's a hotfix. With the GitHub flow, there is no development branch. So as soon as a feature is tested and successful, it gets merged into the main branch straight away. And us devs have been using source control for many years. So if we do things like pair programming, dev and ops members can actually get used to it.
Pair programming?
No, pair programming. This is where two people write the same code together and actually sit next to each other. And I know with COVID-19 situation, that is going to be a bit of a problem. But research has shown it usually takes a bit longer to do. However, it means you end up with more stable code and you learn new coding practices in a more more efficient and faster way.
Wouldn't that mean there's a lot of overhead involved with that practice?
Yeah, like I said, it takes a little longer to do. There's about a 15% overhead involved. But that overhead is largely compensated by the increased quality of code. And that means less bug fixes. And we all know that bug fixes take a lot of time because you have to roll back and fix it and then apply it again. So that costs a lot of money. Of course, there are other methods that we can use, like code reviews. And at the end of the day, we just have to decide what works best for us. So we can do a lot of things.
Okay, so what's to stop somebody coding their own release and pushing it straight to the main branch?
I'm glad you asked that. It looks like Azure DevOps has branching policies that we can use. One of which is that two people have to approve updates to the main branch.
That sounds good. I think we need to do that to be SOX compliant anyway, since we deal with financial data. So with that being said, I suppose I better look and see if I can do it myself. So if we go back into Azure DevOps again, this is basically how a Git repository looks visually within Azure DevOps. So here is basically your database project code. And there's some other things that you can do in Azure Repos as well. For instance, you can view all the commits for your Git repository. You can view your branches here. Of course, tags for anything that's important. And of course, this evening, dataMinds is important. And these are actually exactly the same, bear with me, as the tags that you have normally in the Git command line. So all this is doing is just basically translating this into the GUI for you. Anyway, and pull requests as well. So in order to be SOX compliant, one of the things you have to do is have the 4A principle in place. And you can do that in Azure Repos by clicking on the ellipsis and then scrolling down to branch policies. And then from there, setting the minimum number of reviewers to 2. And then another thing you should do as well for best practice is to automatically include reviewers. So if I click on the plus sign here, you can see I can add Sander. So every time I submit a pull request in Git, Sander will end up getting an email going, Kevin wants to do a pull request. And then you can either approve it or comment on that. And that is how you set your branch policies in place within Azure Repos, within Azure DevOps.
Cool. And these are the main points we want you to take away from this part of Azure DevOps. Azure DevOps supports multiple version control systems. However, if you have the choice, just go for Git, because Git has become the facto standard. And Microsoft is really pointing all their arrows to Git, especially because they bought GitHub. You can secure your updates using branching policies, and Git also hooks really nicely into other tools from Microsoft as well, including Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code, and Azure Data Studio as well.
Indeed, Sander was just saying that it links up to Azure Data Studio. So if you're going to do this in Azure Data Studio, then you need to have this extension installed, which is currently in preview. And then once you have it installed, you can actually go and have a look at your projects. And as you can see here, I conveniently happen to have our project already opened up. And within Azure Data Studio, there's various things you can do to your database projects as well, including build, which will create a DAC pack behind the scenes for you. Publish, so you can actually publish your database project directly into a database, or you can compare your database project to an existing database that you can connect to. I've also seen recently as well, the icons are slightly changing apparently in the future. In the Insiders build, they're experimenting with a new layout. However, this is how it looks at this moment in time. So,
Boards.
So, we better, sorry, my mouse has malfunctioned a bit, as you can tell. So, we better discuss Azure Boards, since I'm going to be using it to organize our backlog items. Now, Azure Boards can use basic, agile, Scrum, or CMMI templates for each project you create in Azure DevOps. Now, just before we go any further, if you use CMMI at the moment for work, can you put your hands up in Teams, please?
I hear crickets.
No, I see hands.
Wow.
That's a first.
Well, if you, it would be very weird if you hear crickets, to be honest. But yeah.
So usually whenever we ask, we never have anybody put their hands up. So that says something. It's an interesting observation for us this evening. So anyway, as I mentioned earlier, these templates are also called a process, as I showed you in the organization settings. Because we're using Scrum Standard, we're probably going to want to use the Scrum process. For now, we can keep it as standard, but we can customize these processes if we need to by adding additional columns and things like that. So we go back to Azure DevOps again, and we have a look at boards. I'm just going to go through the default features that comes with boards, so don't be surprised that I'm not going to go through everything here. So first of all, there's work items, which will display all your work items in a linear format. What I find this really, really useful for is to search for removed items. And it's really good if you think somebody's accidentally removed something. Following on from there, you've got boards, and those of you who've worked with Kanban or Scrumban may realize that this is a very familiar layout, and it's similar to what you get with some other board related applications as well. And if I click on the gears icon, you can see I can do some customizations, just like some other applications, you can do this. So I can change the background of work items depending on what tags they've got, for example. Can also change the columns and the swim lanes as well. Moving on from there, there's backlogs, and this will show you all of your outstanding work items. And for those of you who work with Scrum, there's sprint boards as well. And this will show you all your outstanding work for your current sprint. And as you can see here, somebody's actually still got something that needed to be done. However, I happen to know they did it earlier. So just like most other board applications, you can just drag and drop on your sprint board.
I'm sorry, Kevin.
Slecht. So, and then finally, there's queries, which we'll be covering shortly.
Great. So how are the backlog items organized for Scrum?
Well, if I go back to the backlog board here, it'd be easier for me to show you. So basically, if you're using Scrum, you tend to have one or more epics. Each epic can have one or more features. And then each feature has one or more backlog items. And then during the sprint, you can work on tasks that are part of those backlog items, which you may or may not require. Now, if you were using Agile instead, it would actually be a similar hierarchy, but it would be epics, features, and then user stories instead of backlog items.
So how do you propose we use the boards? I mean, if we just have one big list of all the backlog items, it's going to be pretty cluttered, right?
Yeah, that's true. And that's why I propose that we start giving backlog items sensible tags that we can filter on.
Okay. So how will we know when an item is ready to go into a sprint?
Well, we could tag all the items fine once it's met all the criteria. And then after it's been refined, we can potentially allocate it to a sprint we can view on the sprint board. Another option, which may be a lot simpler, is that we actually just set one of the backlog items to be in the approved state instead, as you can see here. By the way, everybody, the standard criteria for backlog item to be classed as refined in Scrum is that the item is clear and small enough to be part of a sprint. However, bear in mind that businesses can have their own criteria for when an item is refined and ready for a sprint as well.
That all sounds good, but hang on a minute though. I've seen that we have various filters on the backlog board. but you can't show items that don't have a certain tag. How will we know when there are items that are left to be refined?
Oh, you mean when we look up here, because there's a null option and an AND option, but there's not a not option. Well, we have a couple of options. Either we can move these backlog items into a future sprint straight away once they're being refined, which means that we'd have to make sure we don't forget to allocate them, which obviously can be a lot of hard work to do. Or instead, we can just use beautiful queries to show any backlog items that do not have the refine tag. Of course, they're not called beautiful queries, it's just a nickname I've given them. So as you can see here in queries, I've already got a query in place. And if I click on there, it will show me a backlog item that's not got the refine tag. Now, if I click on the editor here, you will see a query design editor, which will probably be very familiar to some of you that have worked with various database applications over the years. And in fact, if you have an extension installed called WCL Query Editor, you can actually directly go in and change the code that's used for these individual queries. And I quite like using this because I find it a lot more flexible. On a side note, by the way, Sander, going back to what you were talking about just now, there was a British guy living abroad who actually put a request in with Microsoft to change this and add a not filter. However, because it wasn't a very popular idea, they decided not to follow through with it, which I can fully understand.
I wonder who that could be. Anyway, talking of sprints, how do we propose we align our Kanban method to the backlog item? I mean, our items only last a couple of days.
Well, if your work items only last a couple of days, it can potentially be converted to a backlog item.
Fair enough. How are we going to know what our sprint goal is, though?
Well, we can actually add an extension to Azure DevOps, which allows you to add one. So if I go back here to our current sprint board, you can see here that I can actually set a go for our sprint.
Okay. So I'm guessing we're still going to use our other application to manage the boards in the meantime, or until we get a good look at this.
Well, it depends on which direction your company wants to go, to be honest. If we're going all in with Azure DevOps, we can still use our application to manage the boards for a while we get used to it. However, personally, if the direction of the company is to go all in with Azure DevOps, I recommend ripping the Band-Aid off and doing the migration as soon as possible, though. By the way, Sander, did I mention all the analytics and preview views we can potentially use with Azure Boards?
We only have 90 minutes, Kevin, so we're not going to make that.
Good point. People will just have to watch our other session elsewhere to see us using Azure Boards more. Anyway, the main thing to take away from this section is that Azure Boards is a very powerful way of managing Scrum or Agile work visually, and in the case of a couple of you here, CMMI, especially if you're a product owner.
So before we go into the pipelines, are there any questions up to now?
I haven't seen any in chat, but people can feel free to start asking them now. But I don't think there are any questions right now, so that means it's all clear up until this point.
Okay,
Thanks.
cool. Well, let's talk about Azure Pipelines then. So, which is where we're going to build and deploy our deliverables.
So how would this work with SQL Server?
Well, we could look at deploying user either state-based or migration-based deployments.
Well, what's the main difference between those two?
Well, the main difference is that with state-based, like it describes, it deploys the entire state of your project in one go. It just checks the differences and then applies the entire script. Whereas with migration-based, you script out the changes since the last change and then apply that incrementally instead. And migration-based can be good, but if there's a problem, we'd have to redeploy all over again. So I think in our situation, state-based is better for us. And it's fairly easy to create such a project, which I will demonstrate right now. Share my screen. If I can get the right one. You can see my PowerShell window right now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So
don't forget to remind everyone that you can use the controller in the mouse scroll button if they want to zoom into Teams, because it's a bit small there at the moment, depending on their screen.
Well, I already enlarged the fonts quite big, so I will zoom into the other applications when the fonts are too small. When I first started to put databases in source control, it was a lot of work. So you have to create a Visual Studio project, and then you create a new project, you give it a name, and then within that solution, I created two different projects. One to hold the data model and one to hold my tests. And that was a lot of work because I had to do it all every single time for every single database. And I am lazy as hell as it comes to repetitive tasks. So I scripted it out, and I found a way to use a PowerShell module called PS Module Development, which is part of the PS Framework PowerShell module. And you can create a template for not just files, but entire directory structures with all the files in there. And with some tweaking and some placement of some tags, I was able to automate that. So if we go and look at that code, this is the SSTT with tSQLt template. It is available on my GitHub page, and it's actually being updated with the latest tSQLt update that has been like 4 weeks ago. And the most important part of it is all the script you see is things taking care of the download and extracting the zip package from my GitHub page and everything. But the most important part is the invoke PSMD template with the template name, the output path, and the project name. And if I run that, let's go back there. It's going to download that project from GitHub, extract it, install it, and then create the project for me. And the longest thing that actually doing is extracting it. But it's already done. So here's my project. Already built everything in my solution. So if I open that, here's Visual Studio. While that's opening, I can actually show you a couple things in here. In the build directory, there are a couple directories that can help you setting up your Azure DevOps pipeline or your GitHub Actions workflow. These contain complete pipeline YAML files or GitHub Action workflows that you can just import and start using it. And you will see later on in our demos, this will test everything for you for SQL Server 2017, 2019, using Docker containers, and everything is set up for you right away. So this is my solution, and I always have like 2 different projects. I want my data model and my tests to be separated from each other. So when I first did everything like that, I had to import my databases. So let's create a small little database that has a couple tables and a couple store procedures. Come on. There we go. My laptop is doing a lot of stuff in the background. Not happy with it. Just creating some store procedures. Tables, and it does like 10 tables, 50 store procedures for that. Give it a couple seconds. While that's running, I'm going to go to my data model. I'm going to right click. I'm going to say import database. I'm going to select my connection. Yeah. Oh, you know what? I'll just type it for. Go. Connect. It should be done by now. Yes, it is. So I'm going to start importing it. Server database compatibility not supported. Of course, that always happens. You know what? Before I did this, I actually created a project.
There's a bit of luck.
Yeah. You know what? The demo gods are never in favor of me, so.
I'm glad you said that the night we decided to do one of the other demos live.
Hey, it was your decision to do that. You said I want to do this live. So this is the same project. I already imported all the projects, and now we come to the part where we are going to use tSQLt. And tSQLt is a unit testing framework. And when I first started to do everything with that, I had to create all these basic unit tests, and I didn't want to do that manually. So what I did was I created a PowerShell module called the tSQLt test generator. And what this does, it takes the current state of your database and then looks at all the objects and then generates all the tests for it. And it does tests like, does my table exist? Does my store procedure exist? But also more intricate tests like the data types. Does my table have the correct columns with the correct data types, precision and length and everything? And it does the same thing for parameters and all the indexes and constraints. So you can end up with like a lot of unit tests if you use this generator. So the code for that looks like this. So again, this is also available on the PowerShell gallery. If you just say install module tSQLt test generator, you'll get the latest version. And the only thing we have to run is the invoke tSQLt test generator. Just point to a database, point to a SQL Server, and then it will extract all these objects for you. Sure, because my computer is doing a lot of stuff in the background. It's going to complain about a lot of stuff. It's not going to be very fast. So it's going to collect all of these tests. Collect all the objects and generate the tests for us. As you can see, it's generating all these tests. And because I did this beforehand, I can then, after that is finished, go to my other project. Say test basic. I always have two different test classes, one for the basic tests and one for the integration tests. Integration tests go into more how all the objects work together. And this is just for basic testing that all the objects are there for a current state of my database. So I'm going to add these items. Let's say add, select everything. And now I have all my tests in my project, and I can use that later on in my pipeline to generate a DAG pack, including all the tests, and then run all the tests, which we'll see later on when Kevin demos his version of the pipeline. Back to you, Kevin.
Okay then. So I did have a quick question for you as well. So if we just go back into my screen a minute. I'm just going to take the screen back. Bear with me a moment. So I have noticed, Sander, when I was just experimenting just now, that we can use GUI tasks or YAML to use for deployment pipelines. Which one should we use?
Well, I wouldn't use the GUI. The GUI is good for exploring things, but in the end, everything is going to be YAML anyway. And the syntax of YAML is, if you dive into it a bit, it's not that complicated. So I would just use YAML right away. And also, if you click an item on in the marketplace, and then fill in all the values that it asks for, and you say insert into your pipeline, it's going to convert it to YAML anyway.
Yeah, I have realized that somebody's been a little bit concerned about use of the word YAML. So I'm just going to put a link to the Azure Pipelines YAML schema into the chat for them, because that's how good I am at these things. So I do actually remember you talking about it earlier, and obviously, as everybody just saw, you actually, through your deployment script, etc., you create the repository that we saw earlier, and of course you have a default pipeline that gets created as well. And whilst you're actually talking to everybody about tSQLt and everything else, I kind of tweaked your pipeline just a little tiny bit for you.
Uh-oh.
So before I go through what I did, I thought it'd be a good idea if we actually saw it in motion as well. So for the first time this evening, I thought it would be good to do this completely live. So let me first just save a change I've made to a column in Azure Data Studio before we go through what I did, and then quickly commit it and send it off to be synced up. So obviously, just like you would with any other update, I'm just going to stage and commit this particular update. And then because I'm going to be very lazy with this demo, I'm just going to click sync, which you tend to use the different pull and push syntax. However, Kevin decided he's going to be very lazy for this particular demo. And by the way, that sync, that isn't native to Git. That's something that Microsoft especially put into products like this and Visual Studio Code. So now that's out of the way and done. Let's go back to the pipelines and I will show you what I've done. So as you could see just now, there is a blue spinning disk, which means that this particular pipeline is actually in progress. So if I scroll down now, I'll show you what I did. So let's look at the top part first. So obviously here's your build and unit testing stages that come with your scripts and deployments usually by default. And I added at the top here, as you can see, 3 new stages. Integration for doing what you were talking about just now with the integration tests. Staging, which is where you tend to do your user acceptance tests. And production. Now, these 3 stages can contain one or more deployments for tSQL Server instances. And in fact, there is a Docker container that I'm using for each of the SQL instances that are represented here. To show you what I mean, if you go onto my Docker dashboard, you can actually see those 3 containers here. On a side note, everybody, this is based on the latest version of Docker Desktop, and I'm actually running it on WSL2 behind the scenes instead of Hyper-V. So if anybody out there is using Docker Desktop on their machines, I do strongly suggest you update your operating system and then install the latest version of Docker if you don't have it set to automatic updates. What I actually did as well, one further thing, after I did this update, I actually took off Hyper-V just to make sure that WSL2 really was working behind the scenes. So just to show you those containers really exist and are doing their job. And as you can see, it's taken a while to do your unit test, so I can carry on from here. So after it's done the unit test, as well as delivering to those 3 environments, you can also see as well that it's going to do a sync with the GitHub repository with GitHub. And I know some of you are probably thinking that it's not very easy to do. You can't really automate that. And to show this, I've actually got my own GitHub repository here. And what happens is when this pipeline finally stage gets to be updated, it's going to update this repository to reflect the changes I made earlier to the Git repository in Azure DevOps. And then once that's done, it will initiate what's called a GitHub action. Now, for those who aren't aware, a GitHub action is actually GitHub's version of CI/CD, which they introduced in the GitHub earlier this year. And it's got very similar functionality to Azure Pipelines. And how it works is that you have YAML files in the workflow section. Apologies for the person who shivers at the thought of YAML, but I'm just about to open this up. So, as you can see here, YAML syntax fully. There is no classic editor option in GitHub. To use GitHub Actions, you actually really do have to use the YAML syntax.
There is some help though. There is IntelliSense that can help you out if you don't know the full commands and everything.
Yeah, in fact, what you can do, and I will show you what Sander is talking about. If you click on Edit to edit the workflow, you will actually have the IntelliSense will appear here if you start typing in. And your marketplace here is actually dynamic. So whereas in Azure DevOps, you have the tasks on show, here you have everything in the marketplace. So, however, I can't show you this fully live yet because the build is still going. So I can talk about the other stages. However, if you do have any questions, by the way, about GitHub Actions, feel free to reach out to myself or Sander because we've both been experimenting with them to do different things. So from there, Sander, as well as doing the sync to GitHub, what I thought I would try and do is actually see if behind the scenes I could create another DAP pack to deploy to Azure SQL Database. And how I actually did that, if I go behind the scenes here, so let's go back and edit the pipeline, and I will show you how I did it. So let's move that out of the way to make this a bit clearer. So what I actually did, because obviously I wanted to do it without having to create multiple database projects, because otherwise we'd have to have one project for SQL Server on premises and then a separate project for Azure SQL Database. And I thought, well, to be honest, that's going to be a burden keeping those in sync. So what I actually figured out a way to do is for this particular pipeline to get the database project we showed earlier in Azure Repos, and I will have that open in a minute to show it again. It actually copied this entire, all of this code basically into a folder behind the scenes. And then it actually manipulated that copy of the code. So once it done the copy, it actually replaced the line of code in the SQL pod file, which sets it to be used for the compatibility level 140 to actually be the compatibility level of an Azure SQL database. Then from there, I had another task in place to create a different DAC pack that's based on that project that we copied behind the scenes just now. So this is all completely behind the scenes on the agent. Nobody can see it. Nobody can change it. It's all done whilst this pipeline is running. And then once that's done, it would publish that artifact and the DAC pack file would be in there. And that DAC pack file would then be able to be used to deploy to Azure SQL databases instead of SQL Server, as you can see here further down. So I did it for Azure SQL database and it worked. So basically, SQL Server and Azure SQL database deployments are all done by just updating one project. So one source of truth instead of many. And then I thought to myself, why stop there? So I got a little bit ambitious. I decided to copy it again and do exactly the same thing behind the scenes for managed instances, thinking this will probably not work. However, I was a little bit surprised, well, because it did work. And I would show you this in Management Studio when I actually get there. Now, I do have to apologize for the resolution, everybody. This is a laptop which I've only just built over the weekend, and I kind of forgot to put the zoom on here before doing this presentation. I will make it up to you in a minute, though, I assure you. So I got it working for managed instances, and as you can see there, I thought, well, if it works for managed instances, I might as well try it with the SQL pools you get with Azure Synapse Analytics as well. And it actually worked. So if we go back in the Management Studio again, and it's a bit small on the resolution here, even though it's in presentation mode. Excuse me. However, it does work. Now, something to bear in mind though, even though it does work with these SQL pools, remember that these SQL pools were originally the Azure SQL data warehouses, and behind the scenes, they're structured differently than SQL Server databases. So basic structure changes will work if you want to use this kind of method and actually update it based on updates to a SQL database. However, if you introduce more complex things, you may have to do some transformations behind the scenes, like I did with the YAML code here. Now, just to show it really did work, and I did say earlier that I would make it up to yourselves, I will actually show you how this actually looks in Azure Synapse, which is currently in preview. So, as you can see here in the workspace, I can actually expand the SQL pool, and this is the one that you saw just now in Management Studio. As you can see here, the actual database that's in place. And in fact, if I'm right, can I do a refresh here? Yes. If the update has worked, it has. So there you go. So the column is now being referred to column A. And like I said, because of the resolution in Management Studio, I thought I'd make it up to all of you and show you how you would be able to view it in the new workspace you get with Azure Synapse instead. So the main thing to take out of all of this is that if you use a little bit of imagination, you can actually update SQL Server databases on premises or in containers like up here. And these containers can be anywhere. They could be on your laptop or they could be in a Kubernetes cluster. If you can connect them from your machine, then you'll be able to connect them to do the update probably. And these also include Kubernetes clusters that you are using with the new Azure Arc technology as well, which is something new and exciting for you all to look at if you haven't looked at it already. So, like I said, with a little bit of thought and a little bit of effort, you can go off and update multiple different types of SQL Server databases, or from just updating this one project in this one repository, as I showed you earlier, when you can just simply update it in Azure Data Studio. And in fact, I can show you how they all look here. So here, for example, if I click on the refresh here, you can see it's changed it straight away to the new column name. And because it's finished on the managed instance as well, you can see again, it's changed. And this is actually Azure SQL database. So I do apologize, everyone. It's changed to column A as well. So that is how you can do that.
So shall I show some differences between Azure Pipelines and the GitHub workflows? Because we have lots of time to do that. So I'm going to share my screen. Oh, enough.
I'm just really glad that that demo actually was all good.
Yeah, pretty good. So when you decide whether or not to use Azure DevOps and the Azure DevOps pipelines or the GitHub workflows, I personally have a feeling that GitHub workflows has a more dense development procedure. So their new features get developed faster than with Azure pipelines, but that's a feeling from me. So if you have the chance, I would play around with both of them, both GitHub workflows or the GitHub or the Azure DevOps pipelines. So, but there are some differences how they approach things. First of all, there's no name. It just has, so this is the Azure pipelines and this is the GitHub workflow. With the GitHub workflow, I can set a name. In the Azure pipelines there isn't. Variables are set differently. You use the environment within the workflow and you use variables within Azure in the pipelines. Triggers are different. So if you want to trigger on a branch in GitHub workflow, you say on. So on a push or a pull request on which branches you want. And with the pipelines, you use the trigger. There are no stages within the GitHub workflow. You just you give it a name, and that is your job to execute. So you have jobs and stages. So you have your stage, then you have jobs, and then you say, okay, it runs on within the GitHub workflow, and within the Azure pipelines, you use a pull. So you use different names for that. Steps is going to be the same, and there is a different way of putting in the display name. You just use name within the GitHub workflows. And then there are some ways differently how to run with scripts and everything. So you just kind of have to figure out how to convert it. But it is pretty similar, but to translate it from your Azure pipelines to a GitHub workflow is going to take some work. It took me not too long, maybe a couple hours to translate it to a GitHub workflow. So the same Azure Pipelines YAML file is now also a GitHub workflow. So these are the main differences that I wanted to point out. There's mostly the same stuff in here. I bet there's going to be some differences you'll find along the way if you have more complex pipelines built into your solution. But like I said, if I had the choice, I would just go for GitHub workflows because I think the development goes a bit faster than Azure Pipelines. Back to you, Kevin.
Oh, thanks for that. I have played with the Azure SQL deploy workflow, and that's works as expected for Azure SQL databases, but however, you can actually use it for the on-premises version as well. However, it's a bit interesting because if you use it for the on-premises version, you have to still still state the server name twice. So
Okay.
maybe they should look to split those up in the future. Who knows? Anyway, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen again. So,
would it be a good point to ask for any questions at this moment?
Yeah, of course, as I was just explaining, the YAML is the future, so.
I have many questions about the future of YAML and a future where YAML is it, but other than that, there's no questions in the chat right now. So please keep going.
Okay, cool.
That sounds good. I did invent JSAML as well whilst you were talking, Sander, which is a combination of JSON and YAML. Maybe that's what that new for 2021, JSAML.
Yeah, I'm not gonna sleep knowing that. So thanks.
Oh man, I don't want to have that. No, don't. Please don't.
Anyway, Sander, what about if you want to use Azure Pipelines to deploy to a large number of SQL servers?
Well, we could use PowerShell to instead from our YAML file to handle deployments, to handle those large number of servers.
You mean like, for example, using something like an API or something? Okay, so how do we know if that worked?
Well, we could get PowerShell to output the XML in a JUnit format, and then use Azure DevOps to use that XML task, which publishes the test results, to view the results visually. And of course, we can put other feedback mechanisms in place as well.
We can do that.
Yeah.
Awesome. So if we go to edit a pipeline in Azure Pipelines, are we limited to those tasks that we saw on the screen earlier?
Nope. We actually can install loads of them from the marketplace. Even if you search, you can get all the results in there. Of course, because we are an enterprise company, we want to have to request to install those instead of just installing them straight away, which you usually do in an enterprise environment, and ask the team who manages Azure DevOps to install that for the enterprise. Because, like we both know, not all those third-party add-ons are tested thoroughly enough.
That's true. It's a bit of a security concern. And to be honest, I didn't realize that the approvals for the extension installations was a thing.
Oh yeah, and it does mean we get help with the security and compliance issues you were talking about earlier in this session.
Oh, good. So, okay, I've seen that we can use Microsoft hosted agents even within our own network on premises, which is service that Microsoft hosts in Azure to do a lot of the processing of the build and release tasks, like building various artifacts and deploying them, as we saw just now with that very interesting pipeline. However, it appears that because of our infrastructure, we'd have a lot of issues internally. For example, we'd have to raise a lot of firewall requests. So maybe we're better off building our own agents internally, Sander.
Maybe, but remember, a lot of us are developers and we don't want to build our own servers. Plus, we'd have to figure out what exactly you have to install, what software we need on those agents, and maintain them, right? Oh.
So,
sorry to interrupt, but there's actually an interesting question that you might want to take now before going on. Is there a charge related to builds and deployments in Azure pipelines in Azure DevOps? Is there a cost incurred?
There is a finite amount of hours you get with the Microsoft hosted agents. And also there are limits in Azure DevOps as well. None of the resources are finite, and that's a very important thing to remember, even though it does seem like it sometimes. So yes, you are limited. I think it's so many hundreds of thousands of hours that you can use. And there's only one parallel job, one per Visual Studio Enterprise subscription. So the more people that have access to your Azure DevOps organization, the better. So for example, if you have two people that do a lot of Azure DevOps presentations together and they share an Azure DevOps organization, then you get to be able to run two parallel jobs together. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
So if anyone's got any more questions, feel free to put your hands up or just interrupt. It's fine from here on, to be honest. Mm-hmm. The only bit I was focusing on earlier was that pipeline. So back to this. And as you can all see here, Microsoft actually provides you with a guide on how to build your own agents. And as you can see here, it may be a bit confusing because the name says it's for GitHub Actions Virtual Agents. And in fact, it used to be originally called just Azure DevOps Agents. However, with the introduction of GitHub Actions earlier this year, Microsoft have decided to provide images for both using exactly the same builds. So all you have to do now is go to this one page and you can either build your own self-hosted Azure DevOps agents or your GitHub Actions runners for use, all from the same images on this one, GitHub.
Cool. Well, if we're going to do that, we might as well run the agent through the command line instead of using it as a service.
How come?
Well, come on, everybody knows that running something through the command line gives you more detailed results.
Well, okay. Well, as you can probably imagine, I actually tested this earlier. So, especially for you, let's see the results on the next slide.
Behold. There's nothing there, Kevin.
That's the result you get. You get a one-liner.
Okay. Next part. Test plans. Of course, we can do all kinds of things with the test plans once we've done the initial build and release before we release elsewhere.
Don't they all have to be automated though? Because that'll take a lot of time on some of the items.
Not necessarily. Your test plans can have manual steps as well, which you can test yourself because you have all the subscriptions in there.
Okay then. So let's go back in then and look at test plans. Oh yeah, so as I can see here, there is a dataMinds test plan that's already been created. So I'm guessing I click on Run for Web Application.
You can.
This is very intuitive here. So basically, there's all the different steps that somebody can put in the test case for you. And I'm guessing if it works okay, we click on the cross, a tick even. If it doesn't work okay, let's tick on there. So if, for example, something broke and I click on create bug, well, that's good. So basically, if a test case fails and we put in there the failure reason, we can actually create a bug straight away based on that failure. That's nice. So let's
You can do
discuss.
other stuff as well.
Apparently, I can capture a screenshot of it, take an image from the screen as well. I can record the screen. And if you really want, you can record the screen with audio as well. Nice. Now, I have to admit, I did actually install the Microsoft Test Runner application, which apparently is an application version of the web application. However, when I went to run it, it actually tried to appear on the far left-hand side of my main screen. So there's a couple of things to remember if you're going to try and use the application version instead of the web application. First of all, you're probably going to need admin rights to be able to install the application on your machine. And secondly, you may want to change your Windows settings for your main monitor, depending on where you want the pop-up to appear. So I see here we've got some other interesting things like the progress report and other things we can do as well with these tests. So this actually looks pretty good.
So we better discuss artifacts here, which is where we can share various things like the NuGet packages with other people in our project or organization. For example, if you create a NuGet package, you can share it within Azure Artifacts for others to use.
That's strange because I couldn't do anything when I tested using the organization. I got free my Visual Studio subscription.
That's because you sometimes have to go to your Visual Studio subscription benefits page and set them up.
Well, on that note, just a reminder for you all that you are eligible to create your own Azure DevOps organization and test things on. And if you have a Visual Studio subscription, it can bring you additional benefits as well. However, I'm just going to quickly show you the artifacts section. I'm sure Sandra's got something to say about creating your own organization as well before I do this.
Yeah, just make sure you create your own organization so you don't break your company's organization when you try to test out things. So don't do these things that we showed you today in the organization, your company's organization.
Yeah, and it's fairly easy to set your own Azure DevOps organization. And once you've set one up for yourself, as you may have already guessed by the fact that me and Sandra keep using the same organization here today, you can actually share your own personal Azure DevOps organization with others. And like I said just now, to answer the question, if the other person happens to have a Visual Studio Enterprise subscription, that can bring some interesting benefits to things that you can do in your own Azure DevOps organization as well. And like I said earlier as well, you get to do more parallel work. So it's really useful. So before we go any further, I just show you all how the artifacts look in Azure DevOps. Now, to use artifacts, you would create what's known as feeds, and you can think of feeds conceptually a bit like Linux repositories, where it's basically a location that people can go to download certain types of packages, like your NuGet and npm packages. However, I have looked continuously and there are no support for PowerShell yet. I'm guessing that's because of the large usage of the PowerShell gallery. However, some of you that use the PowerShell gallery a lot like me may remember the issues with it a couple of weekends back, but I won't talk about that any further right now. So basically you have one of these feeds available, and these feeds have got a couple of really good uses. The first one is that if somebody creates their own npm or NuGet package or some other type of package in the organization, they can upload it to this feed for everybody in your organization to share. Also, if you have very popular packages that people keep downloading from online, like some of the more popular NPM packages that you can get. What you can actually do is use these feeds as a caching area, so to speak, for these packages. So you can put the packages into these feeds for everybody in your organization to use to save on latency. And as I showed you earlier, these do take up storage. So the more packages you put in there, obviously the more storage space they're going to use. But they are really useful, especially if you're in an organization where there's a large amount of .NET development taking place. So, to be honest with you, Sander, there are other features that I'm looking forward to the team using as well. So if we go back to where we were just now in Azure DevOps, for example, there's the dashboards that we could configure. And as you can see, by installing that sprint go at the start daily stand-up, because you're a Scrum Master, you can actually show everybody what the sprint goal is every single morning to remind them. In our case, the sprint goal is to deliver the session in the dataMinds. And from here, you can see as well, there's a velocity chart and a sprint burn down chart as well. And we did really well right towards the end. And of course, we can tailor all of these dashboards for use as well.
Don't forget actually the wiki. Don't forget that one.
Oh yeah, that's true. And for those aren't right, there's a wiki in Azure DevOps, and you can edit it using Markdown language, and that's very good as well. And just like other applications where you can do these kinds of wikis, you can add pages, you can add sub pages, etc. So for example, I could just do it here. Quick sub page. Click on save on there. And then you close it. And that's how easy it is to create a sub page for your wiki in Azure DevOps for use. And of course, as well as the wiki, Sander, there's the analytics views, which you did kind of cap me a bit talking about earlier. I get the feeling that at least one person who's viewing this session at the moment is interested in Power BI. They can correct me if I'm wrong. However, all of these data sets you see here in analytics views can be used as data sets within Power BI. So all of these different metrics here, and that's not all. You can actually add to this as well and create your own custom ones. And these are all metrics based on work done in Azure Boards at this moment in time. So all your bugs, how long it's taken to do particular items, things like that. So you can do lots of powerful analysis in Power BI. So I find that really useful. There is a question that's just popped here. Oh, that was the question we were asked earlier. So that's all good. So as well, because I know you like doing things with code, Sander, there's actually a CLI extension you can install to use as well within Azure DevOps. So I will show it for you now. Example. Let's clear the screen there, make it a bit more tidier for everybody. So I'm just going to bring a help up here, and as you can see, it's fairly new, and a lot of the commands for it is still in preview. However, there are quite a lot of things that you can do with this extension at the moment. I'll just give you one quick example to get over to there. So for example, we can view all the pipelines that we currently have for this our particular project. It returns the results in the JSON format because that's exactly what you want when you've got something this built using YAML, is to have the results back in JSON instead. But
YAML is for configuring stuff and JSON is for saving data. So this makes sense that it is JSON.
How do you explain ARM templates? So yeah.
So where shall we begin then from this point on?
Well, I suggest that we start by getting both teams together and explain to them what we're trying to achieve, because we need to make sure they're on board before we go any further with this.
So anyway, this is all we've got time for today, and I'm wondering if there are any questions left.
And I will stop sharing my screen so it can be, that's a lot better. So, are there any questions from anybody?
Well, no questions from my side. Cool. Stefan?
Perhaps a question. Can you hear me, Benny?
Yeah.
Kevin? Okay,
Go
good.
ahead.
So, if you your Azure DevOps, you start with perhaps a work item, and you start working on it, and you create your branch, and your work is done. You think your work is done, you test it, you deploy it perhaps with a pipeline to your ACC environment. And where does it go from there? I mean, should you already deploy it further on to production, or how do you include the UAT phase in the Azure DevOps or in the CI/CD actually more workflow? Or does Azure DevOps, how should I say, make it easier for your user that I guess should be accepting the change that you made to the program, and let's say to put the perspective of the user in the workflow? How does that work?
Yeah,
I mean, I don't know if you understand the question, but
I do. I know exactly what you're getting at. So I actually deal with this on a daily basis. So what you're actually asking is how to cater. I'll bring up my screen again, and just to reiterate the question for everybody, and also to confirm that I'm understanding it correctly as well.
okay.
When you go to work on these pipelines, what you're asking is there a way to, is everything managed in these different stages? And you're asking about approvals mostly, aren't you?
I guess so, yes.
Yeah. So obviously for demo purposes, we don't put any approvals into this pipeline. So you just see it all flow smoothly.
Mm-hmm.
However, in the real world, you would actually configure them to be based in environments. And then within those environments, for each stage, you will set things like approvals.
Mm-hmm.
So I can now, I've just created a test environment so I can show you. So before you go to, and is it modal? Nope, that's good. So if I bring this back up side by side, this will help everybody understand it a bit better visually as well. So basically, so you've gone from unit testing to integration, and that usually is an automated process anyway. And then once, if everything passes okay with integration, you would have an approval in place, usually either pre or post approval, to say, right, that's worked. Can I move forwards? And if the approval said, yeah, this has passed a certain thing, like for example, it's invoked an Azure function to check something, or if it goes off to query Azure Monitor to check the performance, is the performance good, or has my SQL instance nosedived? And basically, if it's worked, that approval will be a yes to go on to the next stage. And then in staging, once everything's worked and it's looking to go to do the deployment in production, that's where for a lot of companies, especially the larger enterprise one, you're going to want to have the actual approvals come into play. So that's where a person or one or more persons are going to have to approve the deployment for you. And what they will tend to do, they will get an email or some other form of notification that says, okay, you've got to approve this. Now can you go and approve it? And then they will have to go and view the process through the progress even of your pipeline. And if they're happy, there will be a little review option appear here. They'll click a button and they can either approve it or reject it. So to answer your questions, you would sort out different environments for your approvals.
Yeah. So the answer is approvals should, I mean, take care of that. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So you would put your approvals in for people, and like I said, some of the things, some of the approval gates, as I call them, they can be automated as well. Like I said, if you're going from integration to staging, you may want to put in the want it to go from query Azure Monitor and check the performance before it goes any further, etc. And as you can see, there's quite a few different options you can do here for your checks in your environments. It's not just an approval by a person, it can be other processes involved as well. So you got some really useful ways to do it. I hope that helps.
Yeah, so it's similar to the pull request approvals.
Indeed, it's very much like that. You get the email still. In the old GUI version, which is called releases, it's a bit easier for those at the moment because people can actually get the release approvals sent down to Microsoft Teams. However, they've not fully put it in place for the YAML pipelines yet, but you do get the email still. So it just means that whoever's in the release approvals group in your particular project will get the emails. So
I do think that the pull request approvals still have their place, because if you work with features, as soon as you merge something into development, before you push anything to that branch, you will want someone to approve that that is actually a good change and that is tested correctly.
For things like SOCs, you will need it in both anyway, because it's both the 4i principle. So you'll still need the 4i principle for your pull requests. And again, you will need the 4i principle when you're deploying to production as well, if you're in a large financial institution, for example.
Okay, thanks.
That's all right. Like I say, if you have any more questions, obviously, if you remember them later on, feel free to reach out to either of us.
Yeah, so I don't think there's any more questions, at least not in chat. If people have any more questions, they can definitely ask them. But with that said, Kevin, Sander, thanks for a wonderful session.